Hi everyone, my name is Isabelle, and today I will present to you Antidote. We will look at the guide and at the dictionary. So before we continue, I would like to encourage you to look at Veronique's presentation as she introduces other topics of Antidote, such as the correcteur, which is very useful for translators. Now, I'd like to bring your attention to this side on the left. We have different tabs. And if we click on French right here, we also have different tabs. So we can alternate between French and English, and we have the equivalent of each other from one language to the other. So let's start with the English. Sometimes I will alternate between French and English for the purpose of this presentation. And so on the English side, if we click into spelling, it is a place where they give some details and nuances about the French language and English. So spelling conventions, for examples. Here, if we go under national varieties, let's go down. Well, here in UK and US differences, if we click on it, then we can see different differences between the US and in their consonants, and also British, American, Canadian, Australian, New Zealand, and other Englishes such as Irish and Caribbean, and of course some British colonies as well. So this is very good if you're doing some literary translation where you can go into this section and see, oh, this is how I write a certain word. Now, a lexicon. What is the lexicon? Lexicon talks about the morphology and the semiotics, for example, the formation and meaning of words. It talks about the Anglicism and also improprieties. So I encourage you to take a look at this one by yourself. They do talk about Greek and Latin morphemes, neologism, so also some idioms that can be great. Sometimes when you translate, you do need to go back to these idioms that we have in our language, and also false friends, which can be neat at times, redundancies, and of course if you switch to French, you also have the equivalent faux ami, emploi abusif, impropriété sémantique, etc. So I encourage you to flip from French to English at times when you do your own reading of Antidote. However, sometimes it doesn't necessarily have the same equivalent. It will bring you into a different tab, but that's okay. It still has somewhat the same information. Now we have grammar in English, and as expected, well, this part has parts about speech and their function in the French and English language. So, for example, it will introduce you to adjectives, noun, preposition, and so on. As a translator, I don't necessarily use this tab a whole lot. However, I do think that it can be useful at times for when we're not exactly sure, say, which voice to use, or also the mood. This section can be useful for teaching and also for personal use. So if we go in syntax and we go into this section of the program, it will talk to us about the structure of words in a language. It will explain how to negate a statement or how to structure a question, and also just overall how can you use the French and the English language in writing. And so different clauses, content, adverbs. And again, this is more of a theory side of the language. However, it can be useful to brush up on the grammar. It focuses here on symbols that we use in the French and the English language. So, for example, how to use a colon, how to use a comma, how to use periods. And so it will give you an introduction for most of them. So introduction for the hyphen, the dash, the brackets, which can be quite useful, especially like the brackets in French and in English. The parentheses, the question, the quotation mark. And again, if we just switch from French to English, we also have the equivalent in French than in English. Now, let's go into the style. Here in the style, we talk about how to write more skillfully by suggesting conventions, structures, and word choices that will influence how readers perceive one's speech or writing. So, in this section, we have a good repertoire of construction. For example, how to use the passive voice, how also to make construction a bit more impersonal. And then in the vocabulary, which I think is very neat, we have introduction to registers. So as we know, as translators, registers are very, very important. And so here it introduces us to what is a formal language, what is informal, what is offensive, vulgar, taboo, slur, even slang. So it is very nice if we're doing literary translation to go into this section to see, oh, this is how we use these words and this is how it was used back in the days, because they also have old-fashioned and archaic registers. So it's very good to use if you want to brush up on your registers. Also, if you happen to be teaching this, then this is a great tool to have for teaching as well. Now, also in this section, I'd like to introduce you to country-specific words. And so here we have Canadianisms, Americanism, and also Britishism and other ones as well. So from New Zealand, Australia, etc. So this is very good. Again, if we're doing some literary translation, or again, we're trying to do a translation that aim for certain publics or a target public, then that's great to know how to use certain words. For example, here, a toque, which is greatly used in Canada, but however, not necessarily used in Australia, for example. We also talk about redundancies, which can be great at times. And also readability, so how to make a text a bit easier to read, which is a topic that we have been talking about in translation for a while, is how to make a text more easy to read, like the plain language, for example. And so long sentences, one is long, too long, how to use rare words, and etc. Under inclusivity, here we talk about gender neutrality, which is also a hot topic in translation, because with the LGBTQ movement, we are wondering how to be gender neutral in text and in certain circumstances. So this is a great tool to learn about this by yourself. Even titles such as Doctor, Miss, Mrs., Mr., when to use them, and how to really be respectful towards different individuals. So now let's go into the business writing. This is one of my favorite parts because it can be very, very useful for work. For example, here, if you have to write a letter, a professional letter, it gives you a model of a business letter. It also even says how many spaces you need, how to write the address. So that can be really good for work. And then it tells you different components of the letters, the salutation, subject line, etc. Also, if you go in addresses, the parts of an address, then it tells you more about how to write the address in Canada, but also in the UK and in US. You can also click to the French tab, because in French we write letters, addresses different than in English. And again, it's not necessarily equivalent from French to English, but you can alternate. Let's go to typography. Now, in this section, it explains the arrangements of the elements of a text. For instance, how to use spacing, italic text, and the layout of dates and time. In this section, I like to go into the emoticons. So let's go under marks and symbols and emoticons. So I think this is a very funny section to go to, because I didn't thought Antidote would talk about this, but when we write emails, sometimes we might face the dilemma of, do we put a little emoji or not? In this section of Antidote, well, it tells you, hey, here's a smiley face, and here's what it represents. Here is a sad face, and it represents sadness. and surprise, ambiguous, different emoticons, and it tells you when to avoid them, which is great because it is a thing that now we use emoticons a bit more, so it's good to know how and when to use it. Now, the ironic thing is when you go into the French section, Binette et Frimousse under Courriel, they actually have different emoticons. So I'd like you guys to write a comment below that's answers my question. Why do you think there are different emoticons from French into English? I'm curious because I haven't yet figured this one out, and I think it would be interesting to know what you guys have to say about that. I mean, they're only emoticons, but I'd like to get your opinion on that one. Now, in the French section, typographie, under espacement, we have selon le contexte. This section is very interesting because in French, we need some spacing quite often. And here it explains when to use the spaces. And so, for example, is it before or is it after that we put the spacing? So this section is very useful if you want to know how and when to use the spaces in French. However, when you click on the English section, it brings you to ellipses, which I don't really like because it doesn't necessarily tells you how to use the spacing. And again, these sections can be helpful for translation. Say you are doing some literary translation and you need to use the ellipses. So that is a great tool for that. And then if we go again in the French section under typographie, italic, here it tells us how to use the italic in a text. So in general, during foreign languages, titles, examples, etc. And if we click in the English, then again, we get some information about how and when to use italics. So this is great for technical writing. Let's go into phonetics. This section is quite useful if you're studying linguistics. It gives a brief introduction to the relationship between English spelling and pronunciation, the production of speech sounds, the phonetic alphabet, and phonetic variation. Yeah, so we have the whole speech sounds of English here. So if you're an interpreter or you're learning languages and you need to learn the phonetic alphabet, then I highly encourage you to take a look at this section. It's quite lengthy. So it has all the information you need to help you memorize the IPA, the International Phonetic Alphabet. Let's go into history. Now here, if you are fascinated by history, then you will love this section because it gives you all the information you need about every single languages and their history. And so this section is quite different from the dictionary history section because it mainly focuses on the language in itself, versus when we will get into the dictionary, we'll see that the history section of the dictionary focuses more on etymology, so more about a specific word and the history that comes with that specific word. However, in this section, in the guide, we go into the families of the languages and their personal history. Now, finally, let's go into language matters. So what is this section, language matters? Now, this section is quite interesting because it takes a look at the most frequently asked questions of the language or some tricky question. For example, do we use BC before Christ? Or do we use BCE before Common Era? And what is the difference? And so you can look it up. However, when you go into the French language, you will have to look a bit to get the equivalent. However, this one is under ère et siècle, if you would like to read about before Christ, BC, or BCE, before Common Era. And so this pretty much covers the guide and its sections. And so again, it is a great tool, this guide, mainly as a reference for the grammar and orthography use. Also, it can enrich one's writer skills and it's great for proofreading. So I encourage you to go and take a look and get familiar with both the French and the English version.